Okay, hello Cloud Gurus and welcome to this lecture. In this lecture we're going to look at AWS config. Now you may remember from the previous section we did go and turn this on in one region, or at least I did. It has been running for a couple of days, so I'll be able to show you how it all works. And this lecture is going to be a theoretical lecture, but in the next lecture we're going to go in and add some more rules and try and break those rules and have a bit of fun with the service. So let's go ahead. So what is AWS config? Well, I've already explained it, but it is very, very similar to CloudTrail in some respects. So basically, it's a fully managed service that provides you with an AWS resource inventory, so you see all your AWS assets, but it also gives you configuration history and configuration change notifications to enable security and governance. And if you think of the way I like to imagine AWS config is it's recording what goes on inside our AWS environment all the time, and we can actually just go back in time and see what our security group rules were like 2 weeks ago in whatever region in the world that we want. So it gives us the ability to completely audit and see the state of our AWS environment at any given time and any given region throughout the world. So it is really, really powerful stuff. So it enables compliance auditing. Your auditors can go in and see, oh my God, look, you've left port 22 open to the main production web server for our PCI DSS compliant, production site, something like that. So it does enable auditors to go back through time and see what has happened. Gives you the ability to do security analysis. So if something like that happened, you'd find the person who did it and you'd be like, what the hell are you doing? Don't ever do that again. It also gives us resource tracking, so we can see what resources we're using where throughout the entire world. And it gives us essentially configuration snapshots of our environment and also logs the config changes of our environment as well. And it allows you to do automated compliance checking. So if somebody goes in and opens port 22 to your primary web server, it will automatically notify you of that. And we're going to see that in the lab in the very next section or very next lecture of the course. So the key components of AWS config is it's made up of a config dashboard. We then have our config rules. Our rules are split between AWS managed rules and then custom rules that we write ourselves and store inside Lambda. We then can go in and see all our resources, and we can also see our settings. And one thing I will say about AWS config is it's not as slick as CloudTrail. You can't just turn it on for all regions in one click of a button. You actually have to go into each individual region and deploy it. So that's a little bit annoying, but hopefully they'll change that. It's a minor UI thing, I would think. So how does AWS config work? Well, it works a very similar way to the way CloudTrail works. So we've got our AWS environment. We've got some EC2 instances that are behind some security groups. We've got a S3 bucket with some access control lists, etc. And as soon as you go in and make a change, maybe you make a change to the security group or to the bucket access control list, that's going to fire off as an event, and AWS config is going to pick that up. Now, AWS config stores everything inside S3 buckets, so you can actually go into your S3 environment and have a look, and we'll do that in the lab in the very next lecture. And then so what happens is, depending on how you set this up, you can either set this up so that as soon as something changes, it could trigger a Lambda function, or you could actually just schedule a Lambda function to constantly look through the AWS config settings and tell you if something isn't compliant. So you could trigger that, schedule that Lambda function to do it daily to give you an idea. So that once that event has happened, it's going to be sent to Lambda. Lambda is going to use a rule, so it's going to either be the standard rules that AWS supply us with. There's about 40 of them right now. That will change. There always is growing more. I think when they first launched, there was about half that. It was about 18 or 19. And then you can also have your own custom rules that you write yourself. And this is where it's sort of different to CloudTrail. Instead of Lambda then, doing something, or actually it's CloudWatch. Sometimes, you can configure CloudWatch to trigger a Lambda function based off something happening, and then Lambda can go in and, delete an EC2 instance that somebody shouldn't be provisioning. So you have event-driven security. Instead of that doesn't work this way in AWS config. Basically, all Lambda will say is whether or not a rule is being broken or not. If a rule is being broken, what will happen is AWS config will then trigger an SNS notification, and that will then be sent down to your system administrator, who will go in and investigate it. And that is one of my favorite emojis. I've always wanted to use one of the the detective emoji in a course. So there you go. When I was a small business, my bookkeeper was also one of my best friends, and I used to go and put coffee on the company or something, and he would just see it on our bank transactions, and he'd always send me the emoji like, I'm watching you. So yeah, sorry, there we go. Okay, so let's go through some key terminology before we go into our lab. So we have our configuration items, and these are basically just point in times attributes of a resource. So it might be that your WebDMZ security group has port 22 open to the world, as well as port 80 and port 443, something like that. So it's just a point in time attribute of a resource. We then have configuration snapshots, and these are a collection of configuration items, and these basically are taken every 1 hour, 3 hours, 6 hours, 12 hours, or 24 hours, depending on how you configure it. And we'll look at that in the lab. We then have a configuration stream. So this is a stream of changed items. So as soon as you go through and make a change, that's going to be in your configuration stream. We have our configuration history, which is a collection of config items for a resource over time. So we can go back 2 weeks ago and have a look at what our security group looked like 2 weeks ago. And then we have our configuration recorder, and this is essentially what is recording the configuration of our AWS environment and storing that inside S3. So the recorder, in terms of how it's set up, basically it logs our config information for our account in each region. So it's on a per region by region basis. Like I said earlier, there's no real easy way to just go in and turn config on for all regions just yet. Maybe they'll change that. It's all stored in S3, and then you are notified for any kind of issues through SNS once you set that up, and we'll do that in the lab as well. So in terms of what we can see through AWS config, we can see things like the resource type, the resource ID, whether or not it's compliant. We can see the timeline, and inside the timeline, we can see the individual configuration details. We can see the relationships. So this security group, what EC2 instances or RDS instances belong to this security group or are in this security group. We can see changes, and we can see CloudTrail events as well. And then in terms of compliance checks, we're going to have a trigger. A trigger can either be periodic, which is what I was talking about earlier. So, we'd have 1 hour, 3 hours, 6 hours, 12 hours, or 24 hours. Or we can actually set up a configuration snapshot delivery, which is filterable. So as soon as we see a change, to a security group, for example, that could trigger a compliance check. And then we have our managed rules. So our managed rules, there's about 40 at the time of recording. Some of them very basic, but they are very fundamental. We're going to go in and have a look at that in the lab. And so that is it for this lecture, guys. We're ready to go in and have a look at config. So if you've got the time, join me in the next lecture. Thank you.